Hi everybody, my name is Debbie Cenziper and I'm the director of the Medill Investigative Lab in Washington, D.C. I've been a journalist for more than 30 years, most of that time doing investigative reporting at places like the Washington Post and the Miami Herald and the Charlotte Observer in North Carolina. I actually got into investigative reporting as a student journalist at the University of Florida, and I was really interested, even at a very young age, like I suspect many of you are, in really writing about people and places that didn't always get a lot of attention. Writing about women's issues, children's issues, issues that affect disenfranchised or marginalized communities. And what I found at a very young age is how our words can have impact, how they can move people and policymakers and state and federal policymakers to make changes. While I was at the Miami Herald, I wrote a series of stories about affordable housing corruption, about how developers who had promised to build homes for the poor and the working poor, nurses, teachers, construction workers, people who were really priced out of the housing market in Miami, were taking government money meant to build affordable housing for the poor, and they were actually pocketing the money. They were keeping it for themselves, buying artwork and buying mansions and other things, and never built these homes. And I remember the impact that that story had. There were protests and overnight vigils on the steps of County Hall with people, talking to policymakers, yelling at policymakers, where's the housing? Where's the housing? How can something like this happen? And there was a ton of impact from that project. The federal government took over the housing agency, and a couple of these corrupt developers were convicted and went to jail. But I remember the best thing that happened from that project and that investigation is that the city of Miami stepped in with Habitat for Humanity and started building houses that had been promised for poor families. And I was there the day they started cutting the ribbon on some of these new houses, and families started moving in, and I saw what was once this empty field of nothing, and suddenly pink and yellow and blue and green houses were going up. And that was largely because of the investigation that we did. And to see people and families who had never had a home before, the most fundamental thing, a house, get the keys to their first house, that really moved me as a journalist. And it's why I've been doing this for as long as I have. That series was awarded the Pulitzer Prize at the time. And I remember to this day what it was like to see that and to feel that. I actually have a picture on my mantle at home of this woman who got her first house. She was featured in the stories I wrote, and the city stepped in and helped her get into a house. And I keep that picture on my mantle because it reminds me of why I do what I do, and why journalism matters, and why investigative reporting in particular matters now more than ever. And so here at Medill, I run the DC Medill Investigative Lab, and our mission is very focused. We focus on social justice stories about disenfranchised communities, regionally, nationally, even internationally. And our goal at the Medill Investigative Lab in Washington is to find stories that are often overlooked by mainstream media outlets, stories that the Post and the Times and all of our regional and local media outlets maybe aren't seeing or don't have time to cover because they're so busy covering the news of the day. And so we try to find that sweet spot at the Medill Investigative Lab, to find that issue that really needs to be reported, and we want to have impact. Right? We want people to read what we're writing. We want policymakers to potentially listen and propose changes. And so that's the kind of story that we look for at the Medill Investigative Lab. Let me tell you a little bit about the kinds of topics we've looked at. We have looked at opioid abuse in the Pacific Northwest and really talked to families who were devastated by abuse and addiction. We've written about former President Donald Trump's immigration policies and how local police officers and sheriffs in some very conservative small towns around the country were rounding up and detaining undocumented immigrants who had not committed crimes and moving to deport them. We have written about COVID-19's deadly impact on America's nursing homes and published more than a dozen major stories in the Washington Post during the COVID-19 pandemic. We wrote last year about a massive recall of breathing machines and ventilators, often used by very sick people and children, and the elderly, and people who need some help breathing. And there was this massive recall of very dangerous machines. And our investigation into the company that did this recall prompted all kinds of changes. Members of Congress called for criminal investigations. They called for investigations of the Food and Drug Administration, which is the agency responsible for making sure that medical devices are safe. And the company itself settled a massive lawsuit agreeing to pay more than $1 billion, that's billion with a B, to people who had used these potentially deadly machines for so many years. That's the kind of impact we're shooting for at the Medill Investigative Lab. And it's incredible to me as a professor to go on this journey with my students and to see investigative reporting through their eyes and to see that drive and curiosity and excitement, because I know exactly what that feels like. Haven't lost it more than 30 years doing this job. So those are the kinds of things that we focus on at the Medill Investigative Lab, finding that sweet spot, telling stories about real people who are facing challenges. And we don't just focus on local stories, although local stories matter as much as they ever have. We also write about national issues and international issues. And our stories and our reporting has taken us to places like Amsterdam, Panama City, Panama, Denver, the Pacific Northwest, Atlanta, all kinds of places. We go where the stories take us, and we do on-the-ground reporting there. The Medill Investigative Lab is a reporting immersion program at its core. There are no tests, there are no quizzes, there are no assignments. We start on day one running on an investigative story, and we don't stop until you all graduate and you leave me. Sometimes some of my students stay back to keep working with me because they don't want to leave the story or the project behind. But we run on stories, and we run on them together. I am not only your professor, but your editor, your collaborator, and your guide. We work to build investigative stories from the ground up, and that starts on day one. And then the goal is to publish those stories in major media outlets. We have published all of our stories in either the Washington Post or ProPublica. For those of you who don't know ProPublica, it's the largest nonprofit investigative newsroom in the country. I report for ProPublica, and so that's who we're really partnering with these days. And ProPublica has been such a great supporter of our program and our students through this unofficial kind of partnership and collaboration that we have going. A lot of students ask me, how does the program work? Where do you get your story ideas from? How do we pick a story? And so let me give you the details now. The Medill Investigative Lab is a 2-quarter program. It's about 20 weeks. So you will start with me about midway through your journey at Medill as a grad student. And again, we start on day one trying to find a story, and we generally pick one topic that is of interest not only to you and to me, but also to my editors, because I don't want us to do a story that never sees the light of day. I want you guys to be published. I want bylines and contributing lines. The Medill Investigative Lab at its core is a career accelerator. We want you to learn and grow at Medill, and I want you to walk out of Medill and of the Medill Investigative Lab as a working journalist. We have graduates all over the United States working at major media outlets, including Bloomberg, including ProPublica, including the Washington Post. So our goal at Medill, and my personal goal as the director of the Investigative Lab, is to arm you with the skills, the clips, and the resume line that you need to walk out of here and get a great job. We also have a fantastic alumni network, which I'm sure you've heard about, and our alums reach back all the time to help our new grads. And so what we do at the Medill Investigative Lab is we find that big story that we can work on together, and then we take pieces of that, and individually you might report your own story, or you might work with a classmate and you might team up to do a story, and we all then contribute generally to our main investigation. I've had students who had bylines on all major pieces of an investigative story because they were just that involved, that invested, and that good. And so everyone participates, everyone gets credit for their work. We've had students take video, we've had students take photos. We're primarily print-based. I'm a print reporter, but we can do a little bit of everything at the Medill Investigative Lab. We've also brought in working journalists as fellows to work directly with you. The one that comes to mind is Mike Sala, who happens to be a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. As he's won a Pulitzer as a reporter, he's been involved in Pulitzer Prize-winning projects as an editor, and Mike is now the deputy managing editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He oversees investigations. He also works regularly with my students. In fact, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette has hired, I think, 7 of our journalism students, many of them out of the lab, directly out of right after graduation. So we're very proud of that little pipeline to Pittsburgh, which is a great news town for anyone who knows Pittsburgh. And so, as I said, we work together on major stories from the beginning all the way to the end. We start reporting, we use documents, data, people sources. We go wherever the stories take us. We conduct very sensitive interviews with families who are impacted by whatever topic we're writing about. And we conduct, more tense kind of confrontational interviews with the targets of our stories. And so we learn these skills along the way. I will work with you to model these skills, and then I will step back and let you lead the way. One of the things I always say in my job, which I think is one of the best jobs in journalism, is that I always learn. I think I learn as much from my students as you learn from me. You're so curious, you're so compassionate, you're so involved in the events and the world around you, whether it's gun control or the warming of the planet or women's reproductive rights, and I'm always just so amazed at the passion that you bring to journalism and to investigative reporting in particular. It's why I love my job, and it's why I love partnering with you on these kinds of stories. Our stories in the past have brought about great change. We did a series of stories on the movement of illicit wealth around the world, and 9 governments made changes based on the work that we did that was published in ProPublica. Our stories have also, thankfully, won some major journalism awards. Our students have been to the George Polk Awards. It's the oldest award in American journalism. Our students were part of a award-winning team that won a George Polk Award. We've been semi-finalists 3 straight times for Harvard University's Goldsmith Prize for investigative reporting. And this past year, we were lucky enough to be named one of 6 finalists in that award. So my students had a chance to come to Cambridge and celebrate that. We don't do it for the awards, but it is nice to be recognized. And it's great, I think, for students to see that and feel that and experience that at this stage in their career. So that's a brief overview today, the Medill Investigative Lab in Washington, D.C. I am so thrilled that you're interested in the program. You can reach out to me via email at any time. I'm happy to take your questions. I'm really looking forward to hopefully meeting you one day soon. Thanks so much, everybody.